Welcome to another edition of the channel's Mailbag. So what is Mailbag? Well, Mailbag is the part of the channel that you guys actually control. It's based on comments, questions, general feedback that you guys leave either on the YouTube channel, the website, or through one of my social media feeds. Mailbag contains what I think the answer is, what I think my view of the comment is, or sometimes, I just throw it out to the wider audience and say, what do you guys think? That's what Mailbag is. So let's get in to the first mailbag of this session. Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. Next comment question comes from KV Moore. And this is in response to Korg Kronos 3, not an absolute game changer. CS80 not happening might be correct. And KV Moore writes, I remember your channel a few years back. Well, why are you being on my channel a few years back? Why are you not on my channel today? Bit rhetorical, that, isn't it? And you talked about the Nautilus a lot, as well as the Kronos. This was back when I had my Nautilus. I've since traded my Nautilus for another synth, and gladly so. I would have been very upset and felt like I'd been scammed if I kept it only to see the latter release of the Aftertouch version, known as the AT, and later the now release of the Korg Kronos 3. Will I buy a Korg Kronos 3? Actually, probably not. I don't have the space for it. Well, a lot of people will probably say the same thing because it's a big old beast, especially if you have the 88 key. I also have a Roland synth, a module for Roppler duties, and dedicated analog synths for other duties. Now, if Korg were to make a rack mount version of the Kronos sound engine, I might consider that. These companies need to get back into making rack mount MIDI sound modules again. Not everyone has unlimited space for several of these huge keyboards. It's been a long time and it's great to see you posting again. By the way, your studio rig looks very nice. I really like your rack of vintage MIDI modules. I'm also surprised to see you have a Behringer UBXA. How do you like it? Well, I definitely had a view of Korg Nautilus when it came out, I have to be honest. And it took me a long time to go and play following the discontinuation of the Korg Kronos a few years back. And my view, to be honest, has never changed on the Korg Nautilus. It wasn't radical enough for a synthesizer to supersede the Kronos. And I think Korg did themselves injustice by trying to suggest it did. That's the way I'd probably put it. And again, if like you, I'd invested in Nautilus and then saw the AT version come along a little while later, and then had to shell out even more money to upgrade to the AT version, and being even more miffed if you purchase the 76 key version, which is not supported by the AT upgrade. So, I'm quite glad I didn't go and buy a Nautilus, I have to be honest. And I kind of followed in my thinking, I was looking at some fairly prominent Kronos players, thinking specifically of the likes of Mr. Rudess. And he never swapped his Kronos for a Nautilus. Yes, you saw him playing the Nautilus, but if you actually went and saw him live, and I have been to see him live recently, guess what? He had a Kronos 2 on stage, and he's only just taken delivery of his Kronos 3. So that will be swapping out his Kronos 2 on stage. I think he has several Kronos 2s. He's got one that's in his studio, he's got one that's in his stage rig, and he's got another one that kind of is a travel case that sort of travels around the world where he's not playing with Dream Theater. Many like you have queried whether the Korg Kronos 3 module would appear. I think it's more likely that Korg actually might release a desktop version. That seems to be the sort of direction of travel for a lot of these synth manufacturers. And the reason why I think they're going down the desktop module rather than going down the rack module is purely because of the number of buttons and controls on the front of these machines. Now, if you go back to the 80s when the rack mount kind of ruled the roost, if you looked at the synthesizers of the day, most of them had very limited buttons on the front of the synthesizer, and you could get them into a 1 or 2 unit rack. But with the likes of the Kronos, where you've got a decent sized screen, you need to keep the decent sized screen. And then obviously, the number of buttons and sliders on the front of it, that won't go into a 2U. You probably would struggle to get it into a 4U unit for a rack mount. But it will fit quite nicely into a desktop module, as in, the control panel minus the keyboard. So I do think that may be an option. What would even be better if they produced a desktop module that had a 10 or 12-inch tilt screen, just like the Oasis. Now I was going to stop there. Then I turned the page and realised I had more. But you see, the thing is, these are kind of my views, and even though I've been regularly posted, I'm not really big enough channel to get to the top of the lists in some of these areas, and on some of the feeds. So I guess my views won't count. But Korg, if you do watch this, please produce a desktop, because I would buy a desktop at £2,500 because I've got an 88 key keyboard in the form of Kronos 2. So why do I need another 88 keyboard in the form of Kronos 3? But I would buy the actual desktop module. Anyway, now in terms of the other question that you asked about the Behringer UBXA. Well, the reason why I bought the Behringer UBXA is because I wanted the Oberheim UBX. The Oberheim OBXA, and I knew one of the beta testers who fed back on how close the Behringer instrument really was to the original, and personally, because I'm not made of money and I can't afford the original Oberheim machine or the new Oberheim OBX8, which is horrendously expensive for what it was. Personally, you know what, I like the machine. It sounds pretty good. I find the user interface fairly easy to navigate. Although I have to be honest, like everything else, it would be nice to have a bigger screen. The screen's not big enough, although it's probably big enough for what it does. And then Josh wrote back and said, I agree, actually, a desktop might be a good idea with a touchscreen. That would be really nice to have. I would still find a way to squeeze it into my tight space, but you know what, that's doable. On a side note, I'm glad you like the UBXA. I was considering getting the desktop module version of the UBXA. However, Guitar Center had a sale on the Oberheim X8 keyboard desktop back in April, and I went Oberheim X8 desktop version because it was less expensive than the keyboard and it takes less space. The sound on the Oberheim machine is insane. What a beast. One thing I can say about Behringer, though, is it has double the polyphony of the OBX8 and more features. I went with the OBX8 mainly because I prefer the sound over the UBXA based on the online demos I've heard from the owners who currently have it, and my personal experience of playing with the OBX8 at the store. I've grown attached to that sound, and it's just had to have it. You know what? I went back and looked up some of the comments I made on the OBX8 when it came out. And at the time, it was just shy of £5,000 in the UK, and it was, I considered, way too expensive. And then I got completely jumped on by loads of people saying I didn't know what I was talking about. I wasn't a professional musician. If you're a professional musician, you would know that £5,000 wasn't a lot of money. Blah 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 blah. And I do know some fairly heavyweight professional musicians, and even they went £5,000 is too much. But I do feel kind of justified because within 6 months the synthesizer had dropped its price from £5,000 to £3,995. Although at the moment, if you try to buy one at the moment, it's about £4,500, and they aren't really selling. It kind of tells you something, doesn't it? It was like they weren't really selling at £5,000, and that told you something. I don't know whether they sold at £3,995 as well. There are some diehards that go and buy the Oberheim machine, you know, for the fact that it's an Oberheim machine, it's made by Mr. Oberheim. But as far as I'm aware, talking to the people in the shops, it really hasn't sold particularly well in this market. I really didn't have that. You know, to be honest, I didn't have an issue with the synth itself. It was just the price tag of the machine that effectively uses similar technology. So I understand to the Behringer machine, you know, it's pretty much based on this kind of virtual VST analog emulation technology. So, you know, the tones on the Oberheim, which I understand are pretty damn good, you know, with a bit of tweaking, you probably achieve something fairly compatible, maybe not the same, compatible on the UB. And then Josh came back again and said, yeah, I have to agree the price tag for the OBXA was quite high. There's no denying that. £5,000 or even 3.5 for the desktop module is a tough stretch for most people. This was a very big purchase for me as well, making this the second most expensive synth I own as of right now. And it's only a desktop and I didn't get a keyboard. So yeah, that sucker is definitely expensive. By the way, you were told right, the tones on the Oberheim are really very, very good. With that said, the Behringer alternative is an absolute bargain considering the price versus features versus the Oberheim. So taking to that long-winded spiel, what you will, but the way I look at it is the Oberheim UBXA is actually quite good value.